Hey guys, welcome back. So in the previous video we created this stack of waffles. Make sure you watch that first if you haven't already, or you can download the project file on our Patreon and Gumroad page. But anyway, in this video we will create a syrup effect on top of it, and after that we will also add some powdered sugar. A fluid simulation would be ideal for the syrup, but that's a whole thing on its own, and I'd rather keep it a bit more simple here. There are quite some alternatives to get a similar effect, but for this tutorial I'm just going to use a cloth simulation. So let's get ourselves a disk and increase the polygon density. So 20 and 100 segments to start with. We can make this object editable and scale it on one axis so it becomes an oval shape. Then I'm going to make one more adjustment to the shape already by pressing Shift and C to get the search bar and search for the grab tool. With the middle mouse button you can make it larger, and it is the easiest to go in the top view and drag the bottom portion down like it is melting. Maybe also push the sides in a bit like this. Okay, to set this up we have to select 3 waffles and apply a cloth collider tag to them. Then on the disk we can set the cloth tag. We don't really have to change any settings on these, just make sure you've saved your file and then we can hit the play button. Depending on your computer this can be a bit slow. If it totally freezes, you can also use the F8 button to stop the playback too. Once the animation has hit a point where it looks roughly like the shape it is supposed to have, hit the pause button. I forgot adding one more thing, and that's a floor, because that also has to interact with the dripping syrup. So first make sure you reset the animation to its beginning point. Then you can create a floor object, but also get a plane object at the same time, which you can put as a child. Because the cloth collider doesn't really work with an infinite floor, so make sure the cloth collider tag is on that plane and not on the floor. Make sure the floor sits right under the waffles. And try playing the animation again. Then, if you're okay with the current pose, just delete the cloth tags to freeze the result. And I'm going to add a different material on it so you can see it a bit better. And then you can also change your window layout all the way at the top here and pick the sculpt layout. This gives an easier access to the tools we will be using now. Most of the time you just need the pull, grab and smooth tools. The grab tool speaks for itself. You grab a portion and move it to a new spot. And the pull tool will raise the portion you're clicking on. If you hold the Control or Command button while doing that, it will push it down. So with these two I'm adjusting the sides of the disk that didn't really touch the waffle. Maybe if we used more subdivisions on the disk while doing the simulation, this wouldn't be needed, but that would also make things really slow to calculate and maybe even a bit unstable. Now at the front here you notice the jagged lines. This is a good place to use the smooth tool. So that one averages out everything under it and makes it a perfect tool to fix overstretched polygons like these. At the side here I'm also going to pull and push the shape so it kinda looks like it's stick to the waffles instead of just dropping straight down. At the very bottom you can also use the inflate tool to give it a bit more thickness where the drip ends. Okay, it doesn't have to be perfect already, but it looks somewhat right and we can switch back to our standard layout. Let's put the disk inside of a null and put the disk inside of a cloth surface object. You can find that again with the Shift-C option and just typing in cloth surface. And that gives us the option to add some thickness to the shape. Maybe something like 4 cm on this scale will do. And then we can also add a smoothing deformer inside of the null to get rid of the hard lines on this cloth surface. Decrease the strength a bit maybe. And also adjust the stiffness if you notice it changes your sculpted shape too much. Now is a good time to double check your sculpted shape and maybe smooth out some parts with the sculpt tools. For me there are some parts where I'm struggling with the polygons staying too sharp, so maybe I need more subdivisions. Let's go to the polygon mode of the disk object and select all polygons with Ctrl or Command and A. Right click and pick subdivide. Now it is a bit easier to fine tune everything. Once done, create a duplicate of this null and hide it as a backup, so we can merge the original one by selecting all parts, right-clicking and using Connect Objects plus Delete. With the smooth tool, we can now go over the edges one more time, and I can guarantee you this makes a lot of difference in the end result with the syrup material on it. It just needs these rounded edges. So that's all for the syrup. I'm also adding one more waffle on the side, which will not have syrup on it, but which we will use for the powdered sugar. Now for the material of the syrup, it's a really simple one. We can disable the color channel, but enable the transparency one. Give it a syrupy color in here. And we're going to use a refraction of vegetable oil. It's pretty much the same thing. Also enable the additive mode. In the reflectance channel we can also disable the specular layer, but increase the specular strength in the transparency layer instead. It is just a bit easier to control it from one point instead of having two specular reflections on top of each other. Also remember, if you have ambient occlusion enabled in your render settings, make sure that you have the evaluate transparency option enabled, so it sees the syrup as a transparent object and doesn't cast shadows under it. So with this you should know all the basics to sculpt your own dripping syrup and have it look nice in this lighting setup. Okay, now let's move on to the powdered sugar system. I decided to split it up in multiple materials. That way it is easier to control how much powder you want and what parts it should be covering. In a new material, we are going to set up the main parts that will be the same for all the alternations. So the color can be pure white, of course. And then we are going to take a look at the bump channel. Add a noise shader in here, and the Poxo one looks pretty good for this. Make sure the color goes from white to black and not the other way around. And maybe also increase the contrast a bit at the bottom here. So that's all there is to it. But now we should limit this to only some of the top parts, because we didn't throw the waffle in a whole bunch of powder, we just sprinkled it on top of there. So for this first material, we will just limit it to most of the top. Go in the alpha channel and make sure the image alpha option is disabled. Then we can add a layer shader in here and have a noise shader as the first layer. CMON looks good for this one, and it can be soft, so using a grade instead of black may help. And also adjusting the low clipping and contrast is probably needed. On top of that, we can use another noise in the hard light mode. This one is okay by default, but just increase the global scale like 3 times. Then finally, I added a terrain mask on top of that and set the mode to multiply. We will only use the altitude masking for this one. And depending on the size of your scene and objects, the values should be different, but for our waffle, these should do. So with just that, we have a nice coat of powder at the top parts of our waffle. Maybe you also want some powder on that small edge or seam at the side. For that you can duplicate the material and go back in that alpha layer shader, and we only need to adjust the terrain mask on this layer system. Obviously we need very specific values to get it just right, so I recommend using the interactive render region when doing this to get a faster result. Now if you want some more powdered sugar at the bottom of the holes, you can create another duplicate again and use the slope mask instead of the altitude again. You can tweak the angle to make it perfect, but it will probably be around these values. Finally, you may also just want to add a lot of random powder all over the thing, so it doesn't look as uniform. For that, we can use one more duplicate and adjust the altitude settings of the terrain mask again. But now add one more noise layer on top in burn mode. It can be at turbulence, for example, quite large, and also increase the contrast a bit to make it more obvious. You can also use the BCG effect again to increase the contrast even more, so the empty patches are more noticeable. So there you have it. You can combine all these materials on one waffle or just pick a few of them, it's totally up to you. I'm not responsible for you being hungry after watching this video, but I hope you learned something new today. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.